Tonight, imagine a world where darkness falls differently across the earth. The evening sky stretches wide above us, scattered with countless stars that seem closer somehow, their light undimmed by the pale glow we have always known. There is no silver disk hanging in the heavens, no gentle companion that has watched over humanity since our first breath. This is a world without the moon, and everything you think you know about night and day, about seasons and tides, about the very rhythm of life itself would be entirely different. If you are finding peace in this quiet exploration tonight, perhaps you might like to join our gentle community by subscribing to this channel. And if you feel moved to share, tell us in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world right now. For there is something beautiful about knowing we are all here together under the same sky, even if that sky might look so very different than the one we imagine tonight. And if you wish to support these calm journeys we take together, a paid membership helps us continue creating these soft films that we hope bring you rest. The air feels different in this moonless world, perhaps cooler in some places, warmer in others, as if the very breath of the planet has changed its pattern. Sarah walks along the shoreline near the village of Millhaven, her footsteps soft against sand that feels strange beneath her feet. For without the moon's pull, these waves move in ways she has never seen before. The water laps gently, but there is no great surge and retreat, no powerful rhythm that has shaped coastlines for millions of years. Instead, the sea moves with only the whisper of wind and the turning of the earth itself. Above her, the stars shine with a clarity that takes her breath away, each point of light distinct and bright, creating patterns that seem both familiar and utterly foreign. Thomas, walking the hills beyond Millhaven, stops to rest against an old stone wall and looks up at this magnificent display, wondering how different the stories might be that people tell about these star patterns, how different the navigation might be for travelers crossing dark seas, how different the very sense of time itself might feel when there is no waxing and waning to mark the passing days. The darkness here is profound but not frightening, a velvet blackness that seems to hold secrets rather than threats. In this world, perhaps humans learn to see better in the dark, their eyes growing wider over countless generations, their other senses sharpening to compensate for the deeper shadows that fill each night. Sarah reaches down and picks up a smooth pebble from the shore, turning it over in her palm as she considers how this very beach might have formed differently, how the grinding action of tides, so much gentler without the moon's influence, might have left the coastline smoother, softer, with fewer of the dramatic cliffs and rocky outcroppings that mark the shores she knows. The pebble is perfectly round, worn by waters that move in long, slow cycles rather than the twice-daily dance of high and low tide. She wonders about the creatures that might live in these calmer seas, whether the rhythm of their lives would beat to a different drum, whether they would spawn and feed and migrate according to patterns written by sun and season alone, rather than the ancient lunar calendar that seems to pulse through the blood of every living thing. The wind carries the scent of salt and something else, perhaps the smell of forests that grow differently when they are not bathed in moonlight, trees that spread their branches in new ways, flowers that bloom according to schedules written only in starlight and shadow. Thomas begins walking again, following a path that winds through meadows where night-blooming flowers might be entirely different species, or perhaps might not exist at all. Their evolutionary purpose vanished with the silver light that once called them to open their petals in darkness. The grass beneath his feet feels soft and cool, and somewhere in the distance he can hear the gentle sound of a stream that flows steadily, never swelling with the memory of lunar influence on distant mountain snow. He thinks about the people who might have lived in Millhaven in centuries past, how they would have measured time without the convenient lunar calendar, how they might have celebrated different festivals, told different stories, built their homes and planned their crops according to patterns he can barely imagine. The stars will slowly overhead, their positions changing with the season, but never accompanied by that familiar crescent or full circle that has guided so many human endeavors. Sarah finds herself drawn to wonder about the women of this moonless world, how their bodies might have adapted to different cycles, how the very chemistry of human reproduction might have evolved along alternative pathways, synchronized perhaps to the longer rhythms of seasons or the subtle changes in starlight throughout the year. She sits on a piece of driftwood and listens to the gentle susurrus of waves that seem almost like breathing, steady and calm, without the dramatic inhale and exhale of traditional tides. The night air is clean and soft against her skin, and she finds herself thinking about how children in this world might learn to sleep differently, how their dreams might be shaped by different shadows, how the very lullabies their mothers sang might speak of stars instead of the man in the moon, of darkness that embraces rather than light that watches. Thomas reaches the crest of a small hill and pauses there, looking out over the valley where Millhaven nestles in the distance, its windows glowing warmly against the profound darkness. He wonders how people learn to make their way safely through such complete night, whether they developed different technologies earlier, different ways of creating light, different methods of marking paths and finding direction when the sky offers only the slow wheel of stars for guidance. The valley spreads below him like a gentle sea of darkness, broken here and there by the warm yellow spots of human habitation, each one representing lives lived according to rhythms so different from what he knows that they might as well be the lives of people from another planet entirely. Perhaps in this world, people gathered more often in the evenings, drawn together by the depth of darkness, rather than scattered by the soft light of moon phases. Perhaps they told longer stories, sang different songs, created different arts that celebrated the profound mystery of the starlit night. Sarah stands and begins walking again, her path taking her along the water's edge where small stones click softly together with each gentle wave. She thinks about the oceans of this moonless world, how they might support different forms of life, creatures that never learn to time their spawning to lunar cycles, fish that never develop the ability to use moonlight for navigation, coral reefs that bloom and fade according to seasonal temperatures and solar rhythms alone. The water feels warmer than she expected, as if the absence of tidal mixing has allowed the surface to hold the day's heat longer, creating thermal layers that remain stable through the night. She can almost sense the life moving beneath the surface, adapted to this gentler aquatic world, perhaps growing larger or smaller than their counterparts in the world she knows, perhaps developing entirely different strategies for survival in seas that never surge and retreat with the ancient lunar pull. The darkness around her feels vast but welcoming, like a soft blanket that has been spread across the world to encourage rest and reflection. Thomas descends the far side of the hill, following a path that leads through what might once have been farmland. Though the plants growing here seem different somehow, their leaves shaped by growing seasons that never felt the subtle influence of lunar light on plant hormones. Their root systems adapted to soil that was never subjected to the monthly cycle of gravitational pull that might affect the movement of water through earth and stone. He runs his hand along the rough bark of a tree that stands beside the path, wondering if its rings might tell a different story, whether the annual cycles of growth might show different patterns, whether the very chemistry of photosynthesis might proceed along slightly different pathways in a world where chlorophyll never had to compete with the silver light of a full moon. The tree feels solid and ancient, its branches reaching toward stars that seem close enough to pluck like fruit. Somewhere ahead, he can hear Sarah's footsteps on the beach, a soft rhythm that matches his own pace as they both explore this transformed world in their separate ways, each following their own path through the gentle darkness. The night is deep but not cold, filled with the kind of silence that invites thought and wonder rather than fear. Sarah stops walking and sits on the sand, drawing her knees up and wrapping her arms around them as she gazes out over water that stretches to the horizon without a single silver path of moonlight to mark its surface. Instead, the stars reflect in countless tiny points, creating the impression of another sky below, as if she sits between two infinite spaces filled with light. She wonders about the mathematics of this world, how navigation might have developed differently, how astronomy might have grown from different observations, how the very concept of cycles and seasons might be understood through different frameworks when there is no monthly companion to mark the passage of time in convenient, measurable segments. The sand beneath her is soft and fine, shaped by millions of years of gentler wave action, and she lets it run through her fingers as she contemplates the deep history of this alternative Earth, how evolution might have proceeded along different paths, how the first creatures to crawl from these calmer seas might have developed different strategies for survival. Thomas emerges from the meadowland onto a road that leads toward Millhaven, its surface worn smooth by countless feet and wheels, though he suspects the very rhythm of travel might be different in a world where people could not use the moon to judge the best times for journeys, could not plant their departures according to the ancient calendar of waxing and waning light. The road feels familiar under his feet, yet everything about it seems subtly changed, as if it was built by people who thought differently about distance and time and the relationship between human activity and the larger cycles of the world. Ahead of him, the village glows softly in the darkness, and he can almost hear the murmur of voices, people who perhaps gather more closely in the evenings, who have learned different ways of marking celebration and ceremony, who measure their lives by different rhythms entirely. Sarah rises and continues her walk along the shore, feeling as if she is exploring not just a different landscape but a different way of being human entirely, and she wonders what questions tomorrow might bring in this strange and beautiful world. What new mysteries might unfold when the sun rises on a day that has never known the pull of lunar tides or the gentle influence of moonlight on the turning earth. The morning that follows brings with it a different kind of light, one that seems to fall more directly somehow, unfiltered by the gravitational dance that has shaped every dawn since the earth was young. Sarah finds herself walking through the center of Millhaven as the first pale glow touches the eastern horizon, her notebook tucked carefully in her coat pocket, pages filled with observations she made during the night about the strange behavior of the tide pools and the unfamiliar patterns of the stars. The cobblestones beneath her feet are worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, yet they seem to catch the early light in a way that feels different, as if the very quality of shadow and illumination has been altered by the absence of that celestial companion that once pulled at the waters and the blood and the secret rhythms of growth. Thomas stands in the doorway of what might once have been an observatory, though the instruments inside are unlike any that exist in the world we know, designed perhaps to track different movements, to measure different cycles, to read meaning in star patterns that will through darkness unaccompanied by the familiar phases that have marked human time since the first people looked upward and began to count. His fingers trace the smooth brass of a telescope that seems both ancient and strangely advanced, calibrated for observations that would make no sense in a world where the moon's gravitational pull affects the very shape of the Earth itself, causing our planet to bulge slightly at the equator and creating the subtle wobble that gives us our seasons. In this alternative world, he notes quietly in his own journal, the Earth might spin more rapidly on its axis, completing each day in perhaps 20 hours instead of 24, creating a rhythm of life that beats faster, more urgently, though the people who live within that rhythm would know no other pace and might find it perfectly natural. The autumn air carries the scent of leaves that have turned according to a different calendar, one written in solar angles and temperature gradients, rather than the complex interplay of lunar cycles and seasonal change that influences the timing of harvest and dormancy in the world we know. Sarah pauses beside a fountain in the village square, watching the water flow in patterns that seem both familiar and strange, uninfluenced by the subtle tidal effects that reach even into underground springs and aquifers, creating pressure changes so gentle that they are barely measurable yet profound enough to affect the movement of water through rock and soil across continents. She dips her fingers into the cool water and feels its weight, wondering if the very chemistry might be different, if the minerals dissolved from stone might follow different pathways when the Earth's crust is not subjected to the regular flexing and relaxing that occurs as our world passes through the gravitational field of its lunar companion. The water runs between her fingers like liquid starlight, clear and cold, carrying within it the memory of rains that fell according to patterns she can barely imagine, weather systems that developed without the moon's influence on atmospheric pressure and the circulation of air masses around the globe. Thomas adjusts the focus on his telescope and peers through the eyepiece at stars that seem impossibly bright in the pre-dawn sky, their light undimmed by the scattered reflection that usually bounces from the lunar surface to create the soft illumination we know as moonlight. He makes careful notes about the constellations visible from this latitude, sketching patterns that navigators in this world would have learned to read like a vast celestial map, using the slow procession of stars to mark not just direction but the passage of seasons and years. Without the moon to provide a convenient monthly calendar, he realizes human civilization might have developed entirely different systems for measuring time, perhaps based on the subtle changes in stellar positions or the longer cycles of planets as they move through their orbits around the sun. The implications stretch backward through history like ripples in still water, touching every aspect of human culture and development. Sarah walks slowly toward the harbor, where fishing boats rest at anchor in water that barely moves, their hulls settling into mud that has accumulated differently over the centuries, laid down by currents that flow according to wind and temperature rather than the twice-daily surge and retreat of tides. She can see the waterline on the harbor walls, a single mark rather than the multiple stains that would show high and low tide levels, and she wonders about the maritime traditions that might have developed in such a world, how people learned to time their departures and arrivals, how they predicted weather and storms without the lunar cycles that often correlate with changes in atmospheric pressure. The boats themselves seem built differently, with shallower drafts perhaps, designed for waters that do not rise and fall with predictable rhythm, and she imagines the generations of shipwrights who learned their craft according to different principles, different understanding of how vessels should move through water that behaves according to simpler laws. Thomas closes his notebook and steps outside the observatory, breathing deeply of air that tastes of approaching dawn and distant forests where trees grow according to patterns he is only beginning to understand. The absence of lunar influence on plant hormones might mean that flowering and fruiting follow different schedules, that the very chemistry of photosynthesis proceeds along pathways uninterrupted by monthly cycles of reflected light. He thinks about the great forests that might cover more or less of the Earth's surface in such a world, how the distribution of species might be altered by changes in tidal zones and coastal environments, how evolution itself might have proceeded along different branches when the fundamental rhythm of life beats to a different drum. The morning light grows stronger, and he can see Sarah in the distance, walking along the harbor with that careful attention she brings to everything. Her presence in this transformed landscape like a gentle question posed to the universe itself. The season here feels like autumn, but not quite the autumn of the world we know, as if the very quality of change and transition has been altered by the absence of that gravitational companion that affects everything from the migration patterns of birds to the timing of leaf fall and the dormancy cycles of countless creatures. Sarah kneels beside a tidal pool that contains no trace of the dramatic life cycles she might expect to find. No evidence of creatures that spawn according to lunar phases or migrate according to the rhythm of tides. Instead, the water holds different forms entirely, perhaps simpler in some ways, more complex in others, adapted to conditions that remain relatively stable from day to day, season to season. She sketches what she sees in her notebook, trying to capture not just the shapes and colors, but the sense of calm permanence that seems to emanate from these alternative ecosystems. The rock beneath her knees is smooth granite, worn by waves that have lapped gently for millions of years without the grinding action of powerful tides, and she can feel its coolness through her clothes, a reminder that this earth has been shaped by different forces, carved by different rhythms of erosion and deposition. Thomas walks through streets that wind between buildings constructed with stones that might have been quarried differently, cut from cliffs that formed under the influence of gentler coastal processes, their surfaces bearing the marks of wind and rain rather than the dramatic sculpting that occurs where tides surge and retreat across rocky shores twice each day. The architecture itself seems subtly different, as if the builders understood space and time according to different principles, creating structures that respond to daily rather than tidal cycles, designed around the movement of sun and stars rather than the complex interplay of solar and lunar influences on human activity and natural processes. He pauses to examine the carved details around a doorway, running his fingers over stone that has aged according to different patterns of weathering, exposed to moisture and temperature changes that follow simpler cycles, and he wonders about the craftspeople who created such work, how their understanding of durability and beauty might have been shaped by their experience of a world that turns more steadily on its axis. Sarah reaches the end of the harbor wall and turns to look back toward the village, seeing it now in the growing light of morning as a place that exists in harmony with different natural laws, its rhythm attuned to the steady turning of the earth and the reliable progression of seasons unmarked by lunar phases. She makes a final note in her journal about the quality of silence here, how it seems deeper somehow, as if the absence of tidal sounds has created space for different kinds of listening, different awareness of the subtle voices of wind and water and the distant music of the spheres. The lighthouse at the harbor's mouth stands dark, its beacon perhaps unnecessary in a world where navigation follows different principles, where the stars alone provide sufficient guidance for those who have learned to read their ancient language. Thomas joins her there as the sun begins to rise, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that seem both familiar and strange, colors that fall on water unbroken by the silver path that moonlight creates across moving waves. Together they watch the dawn unfold over this alternative world, sensing that their exploration has only begun, that deeper mysteries await in the hours and days ahead, that the questions they have started to ask will lead them into territories of understanding they have barely begun to imagine. The air grows warmer with the sun's ascent, and somewhere in the distance they can hear the gentle sounds of Millhaven beginning to wake, voices calling softly to one another across the quiet streets, footsteps on cobblestones. the creak of doors opening to welcome a day that will unfold according to rhythms written in starlight and shadow, in the steady pulse of a world that spins alone through the darkness, unaccompanied but not unloved, different but no less beautiful for its solitude. And they sense that something in the very fabric of this reality is about to shift, to reveal itself more fully, to show them truths they have not yet imagined about the delicate balance that makes life possible and the countless ways that existence might express itself when the fundamental conditions of possibility are altered in ways both subtle and profound. The day passes quietly around them like water flowing over smooth stones, and as the afternoon light begins to lengthen across Millhaven, Sarah finds herself in what might once have been a library, though the volumes that line these shelves speak of knowledge gathered according to different principles, observations recorded by scholars who understood the world through the lens of its solitude. She opens a leather-bound journal that bears the date 1793, its pages filled with careful drawings of star charts and tidal measurements that show the gentle, steady rhythm of waters that rise and fall only with the pressure of weather systems and the seasonal changes in temperature. The ink has faded to a soft brown, but the careful handwriting remains clear, documenting a lifetime of watching skies that held different promises, different cycles of brightness and shadow. Thomas discovers a collection of maps in a wooden chest, their edges worn soft by countless hands, showing coastlines that curve differently than any he has seen before, harbors that developed according to the logic of rivers meeting seas that do not surge and retreat twice daily. The cartographer who drew these lines understood erosion as a patient process, wind and rain and the steady flow of streams carving channels that remain stable across centuries rather than shifting with each tide. He traces with his finger the outline of what might be the coast near Millhaven, noting how the bays are shallower, more circular, shaped by currents that flow in long, slow patterns rather than the complex eddies and cross-currents created when tidal flows meet the resistance of headlands and underwater ridges. Sarah turns the pages of the old journal slowly, pausing at entries that describe the behavior of fish that spawn according to seasonal temperatures alone, their migrations following the warming and cooling of waters uninfluenced by the monthly cycles that trigger reproduction in so many marine species. The naturalist who kept these records wrote with wonder about creatures that seemed to live according to their own internal clocks, synchronized to rhythms that beat in harmony with the rotation of seasons rather than the complex interplay of solar and lunar influences. She reads about seabirds that nest at different times, their breeding cycles attuned to the availability of food that follows patterns written in ocean temperatures and the subtle changes in daylight rather than the ancient lunar calendar that governs so much of life in the world she knows. The light falling through the library windows grows golden as the afternoon advances, and she can see dust motes dancing in the warm air, each one following its own small trajectory through space that seems somehow more settled, more predictable in a world where atmospheric pressure changes according to weather alone rather than the complex gravitational influences that create the subtle daily variations in air density and movement. Thomas unfolds a larger map that shows the entire region around Millhaven, and he begins to understand how different the landscape might be when coastal processes follow simpler patterns. The river that flows past the village runs straighter here, its mouth less complicated by the buildup of sediment that would typically be stirred and redistributed by tidal action. The wetlands upstream spread in different configurations, their boundaries determined by seasonal flooding and the gradual migration of channels that cut new paths without the regular disturbance of salt water pushing inland twice each day. He makes notes about the implications for the people who first settled this area, how they might have chosen different locations for their homes and farms, how they understood the rhythms of flood and drought, planting and harvest, according to patterns that stretched across longer cycles. Sarah discovers a section of the journal devoted to botanical observations, pages filled with pressed flowers and leaves that tell stories of growth following different rules. The writer noted that certain plants seem to bloom continuously rather than in distinct seasons, their flowering triggered by subtle changes in daylight and temperature rather than the monthly variations in gravitational pull that affect the movement of fluids within plant stems and the timing of reproductive cycles. She examines a dried specimen of what appears to be a night-blooming flower, its petals preserved between sheets of thin paper, wondering if its ancestors evolved to open in the deep darkness of moonless nights, or if perhaps such flowers never developed at all in a world where the quality of nighttime illumination remained constant rather than cycling through the dramatic changes from new moon to full. The afternoon deepens around them, and Thomas moves to a window where he can see the harbor in the distance, the water catching the slanted light in a way that seems almost solid, unbroken by the ripples and currents that would mark the subtle pull and push of tidal forces. He watches a small boat making its way toward shore, its progress steady and unhurried, following a course that seems direct rather than adjusted for the complex calculations that mariners must make when navigating waters that rise and fall according to lunar schedules. The wake behind the vessel spreads in a simple V shape, undisturbed by the crosscurrents and undertows that would complicate such movement in a world where water behaves according to multiple competing influences. Sarah finds herself drawn to the final entries in the old journal, pages that describe the author's growing sense that something fundamental about the world's rhythm had shifted, though the writer could not quite articulate what felt different. The language becomes more tentative, filled with questions about whether the patterns of bird migration seemed altered, whether the timing of seasons felt somehow changed, whether the very quality of sleep and waking followed different cycles than memory suggested. She reads about dreams that seemed more vivid, about a sense of time moving differently, about the feeling that the world itself was listening for something that no longer came, waiting for a rhythm that had somehow been interrupted or lost. The shadows lengthen across the library floor as Thomas discovers a collection of soil samples preserved in small glass vials, each one labeled with locations and dates stretching back over decades. The Earth from different regions shows variations that suggest how geological processes might proceed when not subjected to the regular flexing and relaxing that occurs as the planet passes through gravitational fields that tug at its crust and core. Some samples contain layers that speak of steady deposition rather than the complex patterns of erosion and accumulation that mark coastal areas where tides carry sediment back and forth twice each day. He holds one vial up to the light, seeing in its contents the story of a place where wind and rain alone determined how the landscape wore away and rebuilt itself grain by grain across the centuries. Sarah closes the journal and sits quietly for a moment, feeling the weight of all these accumulated observations, these careful records of a world that followed different laws yet seemed no less intricate or beautiful for its alternative logic. The light through the windows has taken on the particular quality of late afternoon, golden and soft, carrying within it the promise of evening and the deeper mysteries that darkness might reveal. She wonders about the people who lived their entire lives in this transformed world, whether they felt the absence of something they had never known, whether their bodies and spirits carried some ancestral memory of different rhythms, different cycles of brightness and shadow that once guided the deepest patterns of existence. Thomas joins her at the table where the maps remain spread like windows into alternative geographies, their careful lines describing a world that evolved according to principles both simpler and more complex than those that shaped the reality they know. The coastlines drawn in brown ink speak of patience, of changes that occurred across millennia, rather than the daily transformations that mark shores where powerful tides reshape the boundary between land and sea with each cycle. He traces the course of streams that flow more directly to the ocean, uninterrupted by the complex patterns of estuaries where fresh and salt water mingle according to lunar schedules, creating the rich ecosystems that support so much marine life. The evening approaches like a gentle tide, and Sarah finds herself thinking about the children who might have grown up in this alternative Millhaven, how they learned to measure time without the convenient lunar calendar, how they understood the passage of days and seasons through different markers, different celebrations, different ways of being human in a world that turned alone through space. She imagines their games and stories, their lullabies and festivals, all attuned to rhythms that beat according to solar cycles and stellar patterns, rather than the complex interplay of multiple celestial influences. The quality of silence in the library feels profound, as if the absence of one fundamental rhythm has made space for other kinds of listening, other forms of awareness that develop when attention is not divided among competing cycles of brightness and shadow. Thomas rolls the maps carefully and returns them to their chest, sensing that their exploration of this transformed world has only begun to reveal its deeper secrets. The wooden floors creak softly under their feet as they prepare to leave, and through the windows they can see the first stars beginning to appear in a sky that seems both familiar and utterly strange, its darkness unbroken by the reflected light that usually softens the transition from day to night. The air outside carries the scent of evening flowers that might bloom according to different schedules, their fragrance released to attract pollinators that navigate by starlight alone, rather than the complex interplay of solar and lunar illumination that guides so many nocturnal creatures through their essential tasks. Sarah and Thomas walk together through streets that seem to hold their breath, waiting for something that hovers just beyond perception, some revelation that the accumulated weight of their observations has begun to make possible, and they sense that the approaching darkness will bring with it answers to questions they have only begun to learn how to ask, truths about the delicate balance that makes existence possible and the countless ways that life adapts to the fundamental conditions that shape the very possibility of being. And in the growing twilight, they feel the presence of change approaching like weather from a distant horizon, subtle but unmistakable, carrying within it the promise of deeper understanding. The evening settles over Millhaven like silt settling in still water, and Sarah finds herself drawn to a path that leads away from the village center toward what the old maps showed as a place called Starwell, a name that seems to carry its own gentle mystery through the cooling air. Thomas walks beside her, their footsteps soft on packed earth that feels different somehow beneath their feet, more firmly settled perhaps, as if the ground itself has never been subjected to the subtle daily flexing that occurs when gravitational forces pull at soil and stone with regular rhythm. The temperature has dropped only slightly as the sun disappeared behind the western hills, and the air holds its warmth longer than it might in a world where lunar influence affects atmospheric pressure and the circulation of moisture through evening skies. Their path winds between fields where stubble from the recent harvest catches the last traces of reflected starlight, and Sarah notices how the crop rows seem to follow different patterns than she might expect, planted perhaps according to solar angles and seasonal water flow, rather than the complex calculations that farmers use when they time their planting and harvesting according to lunar phases that affect soil moisture and plant growth in ways both subtle and profound. The darkness deepens around them gradually, without the sudden transition that occurs when moonlight normally begins to brighten the landscape after sunset, and they find themselves walking through a world where night falls more completely, more finally, creating a quality of silence that seems to invite different kinds of listening. Thomas pauses to examine a stone wall that borders the path, running his hand along its surface and feeling how the rocks have been worn smooth by weather that follows simpler patterns, rain and wind working together across centuries, without the complex pressure changes that occur as atmospheric systems respond to lunar influence on global air circulation. The stones feel cool and slightly damp, as if they hold moisture differently when not subjected to the regular cycle of gravitational effects that influence how water moves through rock and soil, creating different patterns of absorption and evaporation that might affect everything from the growth of lichen to the rate at which mineral deposits form in cracks and crevices. Sarah stops walking and tilts her head, listening to something that at first seems like silence but gradually reveals itself to be a very soft sound, almost like breathing, coming from somewhere ahead where the path curves toward what might be a small valley or depression in the landscape. The sound has a regular quality, not quite rhythmic but steady, like air moving through a large space or water flowing over stone in patterns uninterrupted by the twice-daily changes in pressure and volume that mark tidal rivers and coastal streams. She motions to Thomas, and together they move forward more slowly, their footsteps careful on ground that seems to absorb sound differently, perhaps because the soil has settled into different densities when not disturbed by the subtle vibrations that travel through the Earth's crust as gravitational forces create tiny but measurable changes in the planet's shape. The path descends gently, and they begin to see a faint glow ahead, not the warm yellow of lamplight or firelight, but something cooler, bluer, more like starlight concentrated and reflected from some surface that catches and holds the illumination in unexpected ways. Thomas reaches into his pocket for the small notebook he has been carrying, but his fingers pause over the pages as he realizes that what they are approaching might require a different kind of attention, a different quality of observation than the careful scientific notes he has been making throughout their exploration of this transformed world. The temperature around them seems to shift subtly, not colder but somehow more present, as if the air itself has become more substantial, carrying within it traces of moisture and mineral scents that speak of underground water and stone worn smooth by processes that operate according to different principles than those that shape the landscapes they know. Sarah feels a change in the texture of the path beneath her feet, the packed earth giving way to something that might be natural stone, worn smooth not by the regular surge and retreat of water following tidal schedules, but by the patient work of streams that flow according to seasonal patterns and the slow changes in underground springs that respond to weather and temperature rather than the complex gravitational influences that affect aquifers and water tables in the world where lunar pull creates subtle but measurable variations in the movement of fluids through rock and soil. The glow ahead grows slightly brighter as they approach, and they begin to hear more clearly the sound that drew them forward, a soft susurrus that seems to emerge from the stone itself, as if the earth here has found its own voice, its own way of expressing the deep currents that flow beneath the surface when not interrupted by the regular cycle of celestial influences that normally affect the movement of groundwater and the pressure of gases trapped in underground chambers. Thomas stops and kneels beside the path, placing his palm flat against the stone surface and feeling a vibration so subtle it might be imagination. A tremor that seems to pulse with the same steady rhythm as the sound they have been following. And he wonders if they have discovered some natural formation that resonates differently in a world where the Earth's crust maintains different patterns of tension and relaxation, different relationships between solid rock and the liquids and gases that move through its hidden spaces. The air carries scents that seem both familiar and strange, mineral odors that suggest deep caves or underground rivers, but also something organic, like plants that might grow in places where sunlight never reaches, but where other forms of energy create conditions suitable for life that follows different rules, different strategies for gathering nutrients and reproducing according to cycles that beat to the rhythm of geological rather than astronomical time. Sarah moves forward until she can see the source of the glow, and her breath catches slightly as she realizes they have found what appears to be a natural pool. Its surface so still it seems almost solid, reflecting not just the stars overhead but somehow concentrating their light, creating an illumination that seems to come from within the water itself rather than merely bouncing off its surface. The pool rests in a circular depression that might have been carved by water flowing in patterns that never change direction with tidal forces, wearing away stone grain by grain according to the patient mathematics of erosion that operates when currents follow consistent paths across millennia rather than shifting twice daily with the pull of lunar gravity. Thomas joins her at the edge of the pool, and together they kneel on stone that feels warm despite the cooling air, as if the rock itself holds heat differently when not subjected to the regular expansion and contraction that occurs as gravitational forces create subtle but measurable changes in the density and structure of solid matter. The water in the pool appears to be several feet deep, its bottom visible through liquid so clear it seems like crystallized air, and Sarah can see what might be springs feeding the pool from below, tiny streams of water that rise through cracks in the stone, carrying with them dissolved minerals that create faint patterns of color and light where they mix with the still surface water. The sound they have been following comes from these springs. She realizes, water moving upward through stone in ways that might be impossible in a world where underground pressure systems respond to lunar influence, creating the complex patterns of flow and restriction that normally govern how groundwater moves through the hidden chambers and channels that honeycomb the Earth's crust beneath every landscape. Thomas dips his fingers into the water and finds it surprisingly warm, as if heated by some source deep underground, perhaps geothermal activity that operates differently when not affected by the gravitational forces that can influence the movement of magma and the behavior of tectonic plates over geological timescales. The water feels slightly heavier than normal water, dense with dissolved minerals that might accumulate differently in springs that flow according to purely terrestrial cycles rather than the complex interplay of celestial influences that affect everything from soil chemistry to the rate at which rocks weather and release their constituent elements into streams and aquifers. Sarah notices that the edges of the pool are lined with formations that look almost like coral but seem to be made of stone, delicate structures that might have grown slowly as mineral-rich water deposited layer upon layer of calcium and other compounds according to patterns that remain stable across centuries, rather than shifting with the monthly variations in acidity and mineral content that occur when water systems respond to lunar cycles that affect everything from rainfall patterns to the chemical processes that occur as water moves through soil and rock. The starlight reflecting from the pool's surface creates patterns that seem to shift and change, even though the water remains perfectly still. And Thomas realizes that what they are seeing might be caused by temperature differences in the water itself. Subtle currents created by the springs feeding the pool from different depths, each one carrying water that has traveled through different layers of rock and emerged with different mineral content and thermal characteristics. The light seems to pulse gently, not with any regular rhythm but with variations that might reflect the natural fluctuations in underground water flow when such systems operate according to purely geological processes rather than the complex gravitational influences that normally affect how fluids move through the Earth's interior spaces. Sarah finds herself thinking about the people who might have discovered this place in earlier times, what they might have thought about water that glows with its own light and stone formations that grow like living things in patterns that follow rules written in the deep chemistry of the Earth itself rather than the celestial mechanics that govern so many natural processes in the world they know. The pool seems to exist in its own bubble of time, following rhythms that stretch across geological ages rather than the daily and monthly cycles that mark most natural phenomena. And she wonders if places like this might be more common in a world where water and stone and the forces that shape them operate according to simpler principles, fewer competing influences, cleaner mathematical relationships between cause and effect. Thomas sits back on his heels and looks around at the stone formations that surround the pool, noting how they seem to spiral outward in patterns that suggest growth rather than erosion, as if the mineral-rich water has been building these structures grain by grain across millennia, creating architecture that follows the logic of crystallization and chemical precipitation rather than the mechanical forces of wind and weather that normally shape rock formations over time. The air above the pool shimmers slightly, heat waves rising from water that maintains its temperature through some underground source that operates according to principles they can only guess at. And he feels the presence of deep processes at work, currents and pressures and chemical reactions that proceed at their own pace, uninfluenced by the external rhythms that normally complicate and interrupt such fundamental transformations. The silence around them feels complete but not empty, filled with the subtle sounds of water moving through stone and air circulating through spaces that might extend far underground, creating acoustic effects that suggest vast chambers and hidden channels where processes continue that began long before human beings walked the earth and will continue long after the last traces of their presence have been worn away by the patient work of elements that operate according to laws older and more fundamental than any celestial dance. Sarah reaches toward the water's surface but stops just short of touching it, sensing somehow that this pool exists in a delicate balance that might be disturbed by even the smallest intervention, and she wonders what secrets it might hold, what stories its mineral-laden depths might tell about the deep history of a world that evolved without the gravitational companion that shaped so many aspects of planetary development. And as she gazes into water that seems to hold starlight like captured dreams, she finds herself asking whether places like this might offer glimpses into alternative possibilities, different ways that life and chemistry and the fundamental forces of change might express themselves when freed from certain constraints, certain rhythms, certain assumptions about how the universe organizes itself across the scales of space and time. The hours that follow their discovery of the glowing pool pass like water seeping through stone, and Sarah finds herself returning again and again to the small glass vial she filled with the luminescent water, holding it up to catch what little light filters through the windows of the cottage where they have taken shelter for the night. The liquid seems to pulse faintly in its container, not with any regular rhythm but with subtle variations that might reflect the ongoing chemical processes that created its unusual properties. And she wonders if the glow comes from minerals dissolved in water that has traveled through rock formations shaped by millions of years of gentle, consistent flow rather than the complex erosion patterns that develop when underground streams respond to tidal pressures and lunar gravitational effects. Thomas sits at a small wooden table, sketching by candlelight the spiral formations they observed around the pool's edge, his pencil moving slowly across paper that seems to absorb the graphite differently in this place, as if even the basic properties of cellulose and carbon respond to environmental conditions that follow alternative physical laws. The drawings emerge gradually, showing delicate structures that might have grown according to crystallization patterns uninterrupted by the regular changes in water chemistry that occur when underground systems pulse with monthly cycles of pressure and mineral concentration. The cottage itself feels different from any building they have known, its stones fitted together with a precision that suggests masonry techniques developed for materials that aged according to different patterns of expansion and contraction, weathering and settlement. Sarah runs her hand along the wall beside her chair and feels how the surface has worn smooth in ways that speak of centuries passing without the subtle daily variations in temperature and humidity that normally occur as atmospheric pressure responds to lunar influence on global weather systems. The mortar between the stones has a peculiar quality, slightly luminescent like the pool water, as if the builders mixed their lime with materials gathered from sources that contained minerals formed under conditions that no longer exist in the world they know. Thomas pauses in his sketching to examine more closely the water sample Sarah collected, noting how tiny particles seem to drift through the liquid in patterns that suggest they are not simply suspended matter but perhaps microscopic formations that grow and dissolve according to chemical processes that operate at different rates when not subjected to the gravitational influences that normally affect the behavior of solutions and the formation of crystals in aqueous environments. The candlelight flickers across the surface of the water in the vial, creating momentary flashes that seem almost like communication, like signals passing between the dissolved minerals and the flame, and he wonders if they have discovered evidence of chemical reactions that proceed according to entirely different kinetics when freed from certain external pressures and cycles. The night outside their windows stretches vast and dark, unbroken by the familiar glow that usually softens the boundary between earth and sky, and through the glass they can see stars that seem closer than they should. Their light undimmed by atmospheric scattering that might be reduced when air pressure systems develop according to simpler patterns, responding only to solar heating and terrestrial weather rather than the complex gravitational influences that normally affect how gases circulate through the upper atmosphere. Sarah opens her notebook and begins writing by the gentle light of their single candle, documenting not just what they observed at the pool but the subtle wrongness that seems to permeate everything in this transformed world. The sense that familiar processes operate according to unfamiliar rules. She describes the way shadows fall with different angles, how surfaces reflect light in unexpected ways, how even the basic act of breathing feels different when atmospheric pressure remains more stable across the daily cycle. The ink flows differently from her pen, she notices, as if the viscosity of the liquid has been altered by environmental conditions that affect the molecular behavior of organic compounds in ways she cannot quite understand. Thomas sets down his pencil and walks to the window, pressing his palm against glass that feels neither warm nor cool but somehow neutral, as if it maintains its temperature through processes that do not depend on the regular transfer of heat that occurs when building materials expand and contract with daily and monthly variations in ambient conditions. Through the window he can see the path they followed to reach Starwell, its pale surface visible even in the starlight, and he realizes that the stone itself might be slightly phosphorescent, containing minerals that absorb and emit light according to cycles that operate across geological rather than astronomical timescales. The landscape beyond seems to hold its breath, waiting for something that hovers just beyond perception. And he senses that their discoveries at the pool represent only the beginning of a larger pattern that stretches across this alternative world like veins of or running through bedrock. Sarah joins him at the window, and together they watch clouds move across the star field in patterns that seem both random and purposeful, driven perhaps by wind systems that develop according to different principles when atmospheric circulation responds only to solar heating and the rotation of the Earth, rather than the complex gravitational influences that normally create the pressure differentials that drive weather patterns across continents and oceans. The clouds themselves seem different, their edges softer perhaps, their movements more fluid, as if water vapor condenses and disperses according to chemical processes that operate more smoothly when not interrupted by the regular variations in atmospheric density that occur as the planet passes through gravitational fields that affect everything from air pressure to the formation of precipitation. The cottage grows cooler as the night advances, but the temperature change feels gradual and natural rather than the sudden drop that often occurs when heat radiation increases under the influence of atmospheric conditions that vary with lunar cycles affecting global air circulation patterns. Thomas returns to his sketches and begins adding notes about the thermal properties they observed at the pool, how the water maintained its warmth despite the cooling air, how the stone formations seemed to generate their own heat through processes that might involve mineral reactions operating at rates unaffected by external gravitational influences on the speed of chemical processes. Sarah continues writing, her observations growing more detailed as she tries to capture the subtle qualities that distinguish this world from the one they know. The way light behaves differently when it does not compete with reflected lunar illumination, how colors seem more saturated in some spectrums and more muted in others, as if the entire electromagnetic environment has shifted in response to the absence of certain celestial influences on atmospheric composition and the behavior of particles in the upper atmosphere. The candle burns steadily between them, its flame unwavering in air that seems more still than it should, less affected perhaps by the subtle convection currents that normally develop when atmospheric pressure varies with gravitational forces that create tiny but measurable changes in air density and temperature distribution within enclosed spaces. Thomas finds himself studying the flame itself, noting how it burns with a color that seems subtly different from what he expects. More blue at the base perhaps, suggesting combustion chemistry that proceeds according to different oxygen concentrations or fuel consumption rates when fire burns in atmosphere that maintains more consistent pressure and composition across daily cycles. Sarah sets down her pen and picks up the vial of glowing water again, tilting it slowly and watching how the liquid moves with a viscosity that seems neither thick nor thin but somehow more responsive to motion, as if the dissolved minerals create internal currents that follow patterns determined by chemical rather than mechanical forces. The luminescence seems stronger now, or perhaps her eyes have adjusted to perceive wavelengths that become more visible in the deeper darkness of a moonless night. And she wonders if the water contains organisms or chemical compounds that react to environmental conditions in ways that would be impossible in a world where electromagnetic fields vary with lunar proximity and gravitational influences on the behavior of charged particles in solution. Thomas begins a new sketch, this one attempting to capture the quality of light they observed emanating from the pool itself, but his pencil seems inadequate to represent illumination that operates according to principles he cannot fully understand. Radiance that emerges from chemical processes rather than thermal or electrical sources, glow that seems to originate from within the molecular structure of matter rather than from energy added to materials from external sources. The paper accepts his marks with a responsiveness that surprises him, graphite adhering to fibers and patterns that seem to enhance rather than merely record his intentions, as if the materials themselves participate in the act of documentation in ways that reflect the alternative physical laws that govern this transformed world. The night deepens around their small circle of candlelight, and through the windows they can hear sounds that might be wind moving through trees that grow according to different patterns of cellular development. Their wood denser perhaps, their bark thicker, their root systems extending deeper into soil that remains more stable when not subjected to the regular flexing and settling that occurs as gravitational forces affect the density and compaction of earth and rock across daily and monthly cycles. Sarah closes her notebook and sits quietly, feeling the weight of all their observations settling into patterns that suggest connections she cannot yet articulate, relationships between the glowing water and the unusual stone formations, between the altered atmospheric conditions and the strange thermal properties of surfaces and substances they have encountered throughout their exploration of this alternative reality. The cottage itself seems to pulse gently around them, its stones expanding and contracting perhaps with rhythms that follow the slow circulation of underground water through foundations that extend deep into bedrock honeycombed with channels carved by streams that flow according to purely terrestrial cycles, rather than the complex patterns that develop when groundwater responds to tidal influences and gravitational effects on the movement of fluids through porous rock. Thomas looks up from his sketching and meets Sarah's eyes across the small table. And in that moment, they both sense that their careful documentation of individual phenomena has begun to reveal the outline of something much larger, a fundamental alteration in the basic conditions that make existence possible, changes so deep and pervasive that they affect everything from the behavior of light and water to the chemical processes that sustain life itself. And as the candle flame wavers slightly, in air that seems to thicken with possibility, they feel the presence of revelation approaching like dawn approaching across a landscape transformed by forces they are only beginning to understand, knowing that tomorrow will bring them closer to answers that may reshape their understanding of what it means for a world to exist alone in the darkness, spinning through space without the gravitational companion that has shaped every aspect of planetary development since the earliest moments of cosmic history. And they sense that the glowing pool at Starwell represents not an isolated anomaly but a window into alternative possibilities, different ways that matter and energy and the fundamental forces of change might organize themselves when freed from certain constraints, certain rhythms, certain assumptions about how the universe expresses its creativity across the infinite scales of space and time. The morning that follows brings with it a quality of light that seems to carry more weight than usual, as if the photons themselves have been altered by their journey through atmosphere that responds to different pressures, different magnetic fields, different gravitational influences than those that shaped the world Sarah and Thomas remember from their dreams. They wake to find that the water in the vial has changed during the night, its glow now clearly visible even in daylight, pulsing with rhythms that seem to echo something they heard in their sleep, a sound like distant waves but softer, more patient, more like the breathing of stone than the restless movement of sea. Thomas examines the sample more closely in the morning light and discovers that tiny crystalline structures have formed overnight, delicate lattices that grow from the dissolved minerals according to patterns that suggest they respond to environmental conditions in ways that would be impossible if the water contained the usual isotopic ratios of hydrogen and oxygen. The familiar molecular arrangements that characterize terrestrial water systems developed under the influence of tidal forces and lunar gravitational effects on the formation of chemical bonds. Sarah finds herself drawn back to the pool at Starwell, walking the path in daylight that reveals details they could not see in the darkness. And she notices that the stone formations extend much further than they realized, creating a network of channels and chambers that might connect underground with other pools, Other sources of the luminescent water that seems to flow according to principles that operate when groundwater systems develop without the complex pressure variations that normally occur as gravitational forces affect the movement of fluids through rock over geological timescales. The spiral structures around the pool's edge show more clearly in daylight, and she can see that they contain what appear to be fossilized impressions of organisms that might have lived in water with different chemical properties. Creatures adapted to conditions that could exist when aquatic environments maintain more stable mineral concentrations and pH levels across seasonal cycles. Thomas joins her at the pool's edge, bringing with him a collection of instruments he found in the cottage. Simple devices that seem designed for measuring properties of water and stone that do not quite match the parameters that such tools would normally assess, calibrated perhaps for detecting variations in electromagnetic fields or chemical compositions that exist when matter organizes itself according to alternative physical laws. The readings he obtains suggest that the water contains trace amounts of elements that should not be stable under normal conditions, isotopes with decay rates that appear to be slowed or accelerated by environmental factors that affect the behavior of atomic nuclei in ways that conventional physics would not predict. And he begins to understand that they may have discovered evidence of a world where the fundamental constants that govern matter and energy operate according to different values, different relationships between force and mass and the passage of time itself. Sarah kneels beside the pool and studies the fossilized impressions more carefully, noting that they show characteristics of both plant and animal forms, but with anatomical features that suggest adaptation to environments where the boundary between organic and inorganic processes might be less distinct, where life might have evolved strategies for incorporating mineral structures directly into biological systems, creating hybrid organisms that function according to principles that bridge chemistry and biology in ways that would be impossible under the gravitational and electromagnetic conditions that shaped evolution in the world they know. The morning air carries scents that seem to emerge from the stone itself, mineral fragrances that suggest chemical processes continuing deep underground, reactions that might have been proceeding for millions of years without interruption, creating accumulations of rare compounds that form when certain elements interact under conditions of steady pressure and temperature, rather than the fluctuating environment that normally exists when geological systems respond to celestial influences on planetary structure and behavior. Thomas measures the temperature of the water at different depths and discovers that it varies in patterns that suggest thermal stratification maintained by currents that flow horizontally rather than vertically, as if the underground sources that feed the pool emerge from different geological layers, each one carrying water that has interacted with different mineral compositions over different timescales, creating a complex chemistry that remains stable because it never experiences the mixing and turbulence that occur when water systems pulse with tidal rhythms and gravitational effects on fluid dynamics. Sarah finds herself thinking about the implications of what they are observing, how a world without lunar influence might develop not just different surface conditions but entirely different relationships between the solid Earth and the water that moves through it, different patterns of mineral formation and erosion, different cycles of chemical concentration and dilution that affect everything from soil composition to the availability of nutrients that support plant growth and the formation of ecosystems that operate according to alternative ecological principles. The pool reflects the morning sky in ways that seem to concentrate rather than simply mirror the light, and she realizes that the water's surface tension might be altered by the unusual mineral content, creating optical properties that affect how electromagnetic radiation passes through the liquid medium, perhaps explaining why the luminescence appears to originate from within the water itself rather than being reflected from external sources of illumination. Thomas collects samples of the fossilized material embedded in the stone formations, noting that the specimens seem to preserve not just the external structures of ancient organisms, but also internal details that suggest these creatures possessed organs or systems that served functions unknown in contemporary biology, perhaps for processing the unusual chemistry of their aquatic environment or for generating the bioluminescence that appears to be a common characteristic of life forms that evolved in water with these particular mineral properties. The stone itself shows evidence of formation processes that would require extremely stable conditions maintained over geological time periods, without the regular stress and relaxation cycles that normally occur as planetary bodies respond to gravitational influences that create tidal flexing in solid matter, and he begins to understand that they may be examining evidence of a world where geological processes proceed more slowly and consistently, allowing for the accumulation of mineral structures, and chemical gradients that would be impossible under conditions of regular gravitational disturbance. Sarah walks around the pool's perimeter, following channels carved in the stone that seem to connect this formation with others hidden beneath the surface. And she discovers that the entire area around Starwell appears to be honeycombed with similar pools and chambers, all of them linked by underground streams that might flow in a vast network extending far beyond what they can see, creating a subsurface ecosystem that operates according to principles that developed when water systems could, maintain stable chemical compositions and flow patterns across millions of years without interruption. The luminescent water seems to respond to her presence, its glow intensifying slightly as she moves closer to different sections of the pool, and she wonders if the chemical processes that create the illumination might be triggered by electromagnetic fields generated by biological activity, by the subtle electrical currents that flow through living tissue and create measurable effects in environments where water contains unusual concentrations of conductive minerals and dissolved ions that respond to organic influences in ways that conventional biochemistry would not predict. Thomas discovers that the instruments he brought show readings that vary depending on their position relative to the pool, as if the entire formation exists within a localized field of some kind, a zone where the basic properties of matter and energy operate according to modified parameters that affect everything from the speed of chemical reactions to the behavior of light and the passage of time itself. And he realizes that they may have found not just a geological anomaly but a window into alternative physical laws that govern the behavior of reality when certain fundamental forces are absent or altered. The morning advances around them with a quality of stillness that seems to slow the very passage of time, and Sarah finds herself sensing that their discoveries at Starwell represent something far more significant than they initially understood. Not merely evidence of different environmental conditions, but proof of alternative possibilities for existence itself, different ways that matter and energy and consciousness might organize themselves when freed from certain constraints that normally limit the expression of cosmic creativity. The fossilized organisms embedded in the stone seem to watch them with preserved eyes that reflect a kind of awareness that bridges the gap between organic and mineral existence. And she wonders if life in this world might have developed along pathways that allow for forms of consciousness that integrate biological and geological processes, creating entities that think and feel according to rhythms that operate across timescales far longer than those that characterize organic life as they know. Thomas steps back from his measurements and looks across the pool towards Sarah, and in that moment they both sense that they stand at the threshold of understanding something that challenges their basic assumptions about the nature of reality, about the conditions that make existence possible, about the relationship between mind and matter and the fundamental forces that shape the universe across all scales of space and time. The water continues to glow with its quiet radiance, holding within its luminescent depths the accumulated wisdom of millions of years of chemical processes that proceeded without interruption, creating conditions that allow for the emergence of phenomena that exist at the intersection of physics and chemistry and biology, and perhaps something else entirely, something that transcends the familiar categories through which they have learned to understand the world and its mysteries. The air around them seems to thicken with possibility, charged with the presence of discoveries that hover just beyond the reach of language, beyond the capacity of conventional concepts to contain or express. And they know that they have found evidence of alternative ways that reality might organize itself, different expressions of the cosmic forces that create and sustain existence across the infinite varieties of worlds that populate the universe, each one following its own unique trajectory, through the space of possible configurations that define what it means for anything to be rather than not to be. And in the growing light of morning, they feel themselves standing at the edge of revelations that will reshape their understanding of everything they thought they knew about the delicate balance that makes life possible and the countless ways that consciousness might emerge from the intersection of matter and energy and time when the fundamental conditions of existence are altered in ways both subtle and profound. And the pool holds its luminescent silence like a question that waits patiently for an answer that may take lifetimes to formulate, lifetimes to understand, lifetimes to integrate into the larger story of what it means to exist in a universe where every world tells its own unique version of the same eternal tale of transformation and becoming. While Sarah and Thomas continue their careful study of the luminescent pool at Starwell, the morning light carries their discoveries across the transformed landscape like seeds on wind that follows patterns uninterrupted by the atmospheric pressure changes that normally occur when celestial bodies create gravitational influences on air circulation and weather systems. In the village of Millhaven, an elderly woman named Eleanor sits by her window, watching clouds move across the sky in formations that seem both familiar and strange. Their edges softer perhaps than she remembers from her childhood dreams. Their movements more fluid, as if water vapor condenses and disperses according to chemical processes that operate more smoothly when not affected by the complex electromagnetic fields that typically surround planetary bodies with lunar companions. She keeps a journal much like the one Sarah discovered in the library, its pages filled with observations about the behavior of birds that migrate according to patterns written in stellar positions, rather than the monthly cycles that normally guide the timing of seasonal movements. And she has begun to notice that certain species seem to navigate by following underground watercourses that flow with unusual consistency, their channels carved by streams that maintain steady flow rates when not subject to the gravitational influences that create tidal effects in groundwater systems. Eleanor's neighbor, a young man named William, tends a garden where plants grow according to schedules that follow solar angles and seasonal temperature changes, rather than the complex hormonal cycles that typically respond to lunar phases affecting the movement of fluids through plant stems and the timing of reproductive processes. His vegetables seem to mature more slowly but with greater consistency, their cellular structures denser perhaps, their nutritional content higher, as if photosynthesis proceeds along pathways that operate more efficiently when not interrupted by the monthly variations in reflected light that normally create subtle but measurable changes in the rate of chemical reactions within chlorophyll molecules. William has noticed that his soil retains moisture differently than he might expect, holding water in patterns that suggest the underground root networks communicate through chemical signals that travel more effectively when groundwater systems maintain stable mineral concentrations rather than experiencing the regular fluctuations in dissolved nutrients that occur when aquifer chemistry responds to tidal pressures and gravitational effects on the movement of ions through porous rock. The path that connects Millhaven to other settlements follows routes that seem to have been determined by different principles than those that normally guide the development of transportation networks, winding through valleys where streams cut channels that remain stable across centuries rather than shifting with the erosion patterns that develop when water flow varies with tidal influences on river systems and coastal drainage. Eleanor often walks this path in the early morning, carrying with her a collection of smooth stones that she has gathered from places where underground springs emerge to feed pools that glow with the same gentle radiance they have observed at Starwell. And she has begun to map a network of such formations that extends throughout the region around a place called Thornfield, where the oldest families speak of ancestors who understood the language of luminescent water and the secret rhythms that govern the growth of crystal formations in caves that remain stable when not subjected to the regular stress cycles that normally affect rock structure and mineral formation. William sometimes accompanies Eleanor on these walks, bringing with him samples of soil and plant material that show unusual properties when examined closely, root systems that seem to incorporate mineral structures directly into their biological processes, leaves that contain crystalline formations within their cellular matrix, flowers that emit light wavelengths that suggest photosynthetic chemistry operating according to principles that would be impossible under normal electromagnetic conditions but become feasible when plant life evolves in environments where the fundamental constants that govern atomic behavior have been altered by the absence of certain gravitational influences on molecular structure and chemical bonding. The wind that moves through the landscape around Thornfield carries scents that seem to emerge from deep underground, mineral fragrances that suggest ongoing chemical processes in rock formations that have remained undisturbed for geological ages, creating accumulations of rare compounds that form when elements interact under conditions of steady pressure and temperature, rather than the fluctuating environment that typically exists when planetary systems respond to complex gravitational relationships between multiple celestial bodies. Eleanor has documented changes in the behavior of underground streams that flow beneath Thornfield, noting that water emerges from springs with different thermal properties and mineral content depending on which geological layers it has passed through during its journey from distant mountain regions where snow melts according to patterns that reflect solar heating alone, rather than the complex interactions between temperature and gravitational effects that normally influence the timing and rate of seasonal water flow into aquifer systems. The stone formations around these springs show evidence of growth patterns that suggest mineral deposition occurring at rates that would require extremely stable chemical conditions maintained over periods that span multiple geological epochs. And William has observed that certain areas around Thornfield seem to exist within localized fields where the basic properties of matter behave according to modified parameters, affecting everything from the speed of crystallization to the behavior of electromagnetic radiation and the passage of time itself as measured by biological and chemical processes. Eleanor's journal contains sketches of fossilized organisms that appear to represent transitional forms between familiar species and creatures that developed along entirely different evolutionary pathways. Adapted to aquatic environments where the chemistry of water allowed for the emergence of biological structures that incorporate mineral components directly into living tissue, creating hybrid entities that function according to principles that bridge organic and inorganic processes in ways that reflect the alternative physical laws governing this transformed world. The morning light that falls across Thornfield seems to carry within it information that affects the growth patterns of plants and the behavior of animals in subtle but measurable ways. And William has begun to understand that the entire ecosystem in this region operates according to principles that developed when environmental conditions could remain stable across timescales that allow for the emergence of complex relationships between different forms of life and the geological processes that shape their habitat. The paths that connect Thornfield to other settlements follow routes that seem to have been determined by the flow of underground water rather than the typical considerations of terrain and distance, winding through landscapes where the boundary between surface and subsurface processes becomes less distinct, where the movement of minerals through soil and rock creates patterns that influence the development of vegetation and the formation of microclimates that support species adapted to conditions that exist when ecosystem chemistry operates according to different rules. Eleanor and William often meet other travelers on these paths, people who carry their own collections of unusual stones and plant specimens, sharing observations about phenomena that suggest the entire region around Thornfield and Millhaven exists within a zone where the fundamental forces that govern matter and energy express themselves according to alternative configurations, creating conditions that allow for the emergence of forms of existence that transcend the familiar categories through which they normally understand the relationship between living and non-living systems. The conversations that develop among these travelers reveal a growing awareness that their individual discoveries represent fragments of a larger pattern that stretches across the transformed landscape like veins of or running through bedrock, connecting isolated phenomena through underground networks that operate according to principles that become visible only when observed from perspectives that encompass longer timescales and larger spatial dimensions than those that typically characterize human understanding of natural processes. The stars that become visible as evening approaches seem to shine with unusual clarity through atmosphere that responds to different pressure systems and electromagnetic conditions. And Eleanor has noted that certain constellations appear to pulse with rhythms that correlate with the luminescence observed in underground pools and the growth patterns of crystal formations in caves that extend deep into rock structures that have remained stable for millions of years without the regular flexing and settling that normally occurs when planetary bodies respond to gravitational influences from lunar companions. William has begun to document correlations between stellar positions and the timing of various biological processes in plants and animals that seem to navigate according to celestial patterns rather than the monthly cycles that typically govern reproductive timing and seasonal migration. And he suspects that life in this transformed world has developed strategies for synchronizing internal rhythms with astronomical phenomena that operate across much longer timescales than those that characterize lunar influences on biological systems. The evening air carries sounds that seem to emerge from the stone itself, vibrations that suggest ongoing geological processes in underground chambers where water flows through channels carved by streams that maintain consistent patterns of erosion and mineral deposition, when not subjected to the complex pressure variations that normally occur as gravitational forces affect fluid dynamics and chemical reactions in aqueous systems. Eleanor and William find themselves drawn back toward the paths that lead to Starwell, sensing that their separate explorations around Thornfield have revealed pieces of the same fundamental puzzle that Sarah and Thomas are working to understand. Fragments of evidence that point toward alternative ways that reality might organize itself when certain basic conditions of existence are altered in ways that affect everything from the behavior of atoms to the emergence of consciousness from the intersection of matter and energy and time. The night deepens around them as they walk, their footsteps soft on paths that seem to absorb sound differently, and they carry with them the growing awareness that their discoveries represent not isolated anomalies but expressions of systematic changes in the physical laws that govern the behavior of everything from the smallest particles to the largest structures that define the architecture of existence itself. And they know that the luminescent pools and crystal formations and hybrid organisms they have documented offer glimpses into possibilities that challenge their most fundamental assumptions about what it means for worlds to exist and evolve, and support the emergence of forms of awareness that might transcend the familiar boundaries between mind and matter, between organic and inorganic processes, between the temporal rhythms that characterize individual lives and the geological cycles that shape the deeper history of planets that follow their own unique trajectories. Through the infinite space of possible configurations that define the cosmic conditions under which existence becomes not just possible but inevitable. The patterns that Sarah and Thomas have begun to recognize at Starwell, and that Eleanor and William have documented in their explorations around Thornfield, might represent evidence of how matter and energy organize themselves when freed from certain gravitational constraints that normally shape the development of planetary systems. Or perhaps they reveal something deeper about the nature of existence itself, the way consciousness and matter interact when environmental conditions allow for forms of awareness that bridge the gap between organic and inorganic processes. The luminescent pools could be windows into alternative chemistry, water systems that developed when aquifer networks could maintain stable mineral concentrations across geological timescales, creating conditions where dissolved elements interact according to principles that operate when chemical reactions proceed without the regular pressure variations that typically affect the formation of molecular bonds and the behavior of ions in solution. The crystal formations that grow around these pools might tell stories of patient accumulation, minerals depositing layer upon layer according to rhythms that stretch across millions of years, each increment added when chemical conditions remained constant enough to allow for the emergence of structures that would be impossible under the fluctuating environment that normally exists when underground water systems respond to tidal influences and gravitational effects on fluid dynamics. The fossilized organisms embedded in the stone around Starwell and Thornfield could represent evolutionary experiments, life forms that developed along pathways that became possible when biological systems could adapt to environmental conditions that remained stable across timescales long enough for the emergence of hybrid strategies that incorporate mineral processes directly into organic functions, creating entities that exist at the intersection of chemistry and biology in ways that transcend familiar categories. The altered atmospheric conditions that affect how light moves through air and how sounds travel across landscapes might reflect changes in the fundamental constants that govern electromagnetic behavior. Modifications in the speed at which photons interact with particles when planetary magnetic fields develop according to different patterns, uninfluenced by the complex gravitational relationships that normally exist between celestial bodies and their lunar companions. The thermal properties of stone and water that Sarah and Thomas have measured could indicate that heat transfer operates according to modified principles when matter exists in environments where gravitational effects on atomic structure have been altered, creating conditions where the basic laws of thermodynamics express themselves through different relationships between energy and mass and the passage of time as measured by the rate of molecular motion and chemical reactions. The underground networks that connect the glowing pools might represent geological architecture that developed when water could carve channels and chambers according to purely terrestrial forces, streams following paths determined by bedrock composition and temperature gradients, rather than the complex erosion patterns that typically emerge when underground water systems pulse with tidal rhythms and respond to gravitational influences on pressure and flow rate. The plants that William has observed growing with unusual density and mineral content could be evidence of photosynthetic processes that operate more efficiently when not interrupted by monthly variations in reflected light, chlorophyll molecules following chemical pathways that proceed according to consistent solar input rather than the complex electromagnetic environment that normally results from the interaction between direct sunlight and lunar illumination scattered through atmospheric particles. The behavioral changes in birds and other animals that Eleanor has documented might reflect navigation strategies that developed when migration could be timed according to stellar positions and seasonal temperature changes alone. Internal biological clocks synchronizing with astronomical phenomena that operate across longer timescales than the monthly cycles that typically influence reproductive timing and territorial behavior in creatures adapted to environments where lunar gravitational effects create regular variations in atmospheric pressure and electromagnetic fields. The The soil composition around Thornfield that retains moisture in unusual patterns could indicate that root systems and underground fungal networks communicate through chemical signals that travel more effectively when groundwater maintains stable mineral concentrations, creating ecosystem relationships that develop according to principles of cooperation and resource sharing that become possible when environmental chemistry operates according to predictable rules rather than fluctuating conditions that require competitive strategies for survival. The correlation between stellar positions and the timing of biological processes that William has begun to document might suggest that life in this transformed world has learned to read cosmic rhythms that operate across vastly different timescales. Consciousness emerging at the intersection of individual awareness and cosmic cycles that stretch across astronomical distances and geological epochs, creating forms of understanding that transcend the temporal boundaries that normally separate. Personal experience from the larger patterns that govern planetary and stellar evolution. The acoustic properties of the landscape around Starwell and Thornfield. The way sound travels through stone and air in patterns that seem to carry information across distances could reflect modifications in the physical medium through which waves propagate when matter exists in gravitational fields that have been simplified, reduced to relationships between mass and energy that operate according to more direct mathematical principles than those that characterize environments where multiple celestial bodies create complex interference patterns in the fabric of space and time itself. The luminescence that emerges from water and stone might represent bioluminescence that developed when organisms could establish stable relationships with mineral processes, hybrid entities that generate light through chemical reactions that bridge organic and inorganic chemistry, creating forms of existence that think and feel according to rhythms that operate across timescales far longer than those that characterize purely biological consciousness but far shorter than those that govern geological processes in the world they know. The temperature variations that Thomas has measured in the glowing pools could indicate convection patterns that develop when water circulation operates according to simplified fluid dynamics, thermal energy moving through liquid media in ways that create stable stratification rather than the turbulent mixing that typically occurs when aquatic systems respond to gravitational influences that create complex pressure differentials and current patterns that prevent the formation of consistent chemical gradients across depth and distance. The fossilized evidence of hybrid organisms might represent successful evolutionary strategies that emerged when life could experiment with incorporating mineral structures into biological processes. Consciousness learning to extend itself through crystalline networks that store and process information according to principles that operate at the intersection of neural chemistry and geological time, creating forms of awareness that persist across individual lifetimes while remaining connected to the ongoing chemical processes that sustain ecosystem relationships. The way light behaves differently in this transformed environment, concentrating and reflecting according to patterns that seem to enhance rather than simply transmit electromagnetic radiation, could suggest that the fundamental relationship between energy and matter has been modified. Photons interacting with atomic structures in ways that create conditions where information can be stored and retrieved through processes that bridge quantum mechanics and macroscopic phenomena. Consciousness. Emerging from the intersection of electromagnetic fields and molecular chemistry in configurations that become possible when environmental conditions operate according to alternative physical laws. The underground chambers that seem to extend throughout the region around Starwell and Thornfield might represent natural architecture that developed when geological processes could proceed according to consistent mathematical principles, water and chemical dissolution carving spaces that follow geometric patterns determined by crystalline structure and mineral composition rather than the irregular forms that typically result when rock formation and erosion occur under the influence of complex gravitational relationships that create stress patterns and pressure variations that interrupt the orderly development of underground spaces. The correlations that Eleanor has observed between atmospheric conditions and the behavior of underground water systems could indicate that weather patterns operate according to simplified dynamics when air circulation responds only to solar heating and planetary rotation, creating more predictable relationships between temperature and pressure that allow for the development of stable microclimates where specific chemical conditions can persist across seasons and years rather than fluctuating according to the complex patterns that normally result from lunar gravitational effects on atmospheric density and circulation. The crystalline formations that appear to grow within plant tissue and animal organs might represent evolutionary adaptations that allow biological systems to interface directly with mineral processes. Consciousness learning to extend its influence through inorganic structures that store memories and process information according to principles that operate across timescales that bridge individual experience and geological history, creating forms of awareness that exist simultaneously within. Organic neural networks and crystalline matrices that preserve and transmit knowledge across generations through chemical rather than genetic mechanisms. The quality of silence that pervades the transformed landscape might reflect acoustic conditions that develop when sound propagation operates according to modified principles, air and stone conducting vibrations in ways that allow for forms of communication that transcend the usual boundaries between individual consciousness and environmental awareness, creating possibilities for telepathic or empathic connections that emerge when the physical medium through which information travels has been altered by changes in the fundamental constants that govern electromagnetic behavior and the interaction between matter and energy across all scales of space and time. The sense that time itself moves differently in this world, proceeding according to rhythms that feel both slower and more urgent than those that characterize normal experience, could indicate that temporal flow operates according to alternative relationships between consciousness and the physical processes that create the subjective experience of duration and sequence, moments unfolding according to patterns that reflect the deeper mathematical principles that govern how existence organizes itself when freed from certain constraints that normally limit the ways that awareness can interface with the ongoing transformation of matter and energy through space. And as the patterns they have discovered begin to suggest possibilities that challenge every assumption about the nature of reality and the conditions that make consciousness possible, Sarah and Thomas and Eleanor and William find themselves asking not just what this transformed world might tell them about alternative ways that planets can evolve and support life, but what it might reveal about the deepest nature of existence itself, about whether the familiar boundaries between mind and matter, between individual awareness and cosmic process, between the temporal rhythms of biological life and the eternal mathematics that govern the behavior of energy and matter across all scales of space and time, represent fundamental aspects of reality or simply the particular conditions that characterize one possible configuration among the infinite varieties of existence that populate the universe, each one following its own unique trajectory through the space of possible relationships between consciousness and the physical processes that create and sustain the ongoing transformation of everything that is into everything that might become, and in the growing recognition that their discoveries point toward questions far deeper than they initially imagined, they wonder whether the real mystery might not be how this world came to exist without its lunar companion, but how any world comes to exist at all, and what it means for consciousness to emerge from the intersection of matter and energy and time in ways that allow existence itself to become aware of its own infinite creativity. In the quiet hours that follow their discoveries, Sarah finds herself sitting beside the luminescent pool at Starwell, her hands cupped around a warm cup of tea that steams gently in the cool night air, and she thinks about the patience that brought them to this moment, the slow accumulation of observations and questions that built like sediment settling in still water until their weight created its own understanding. Thomas walks the perimeter of the pool with unhurried steps, his lamp casting soft circles of yellow light that dance across stone formations that have grown grain by grain across centuries, each increment added through processes that operate according to rhythms far slower than human heartbeats, yet somehow perfectly attuned to the deeper pulse that moves through all things when given time enough to express their essential nature. The night around them holds the kind of silence that invites contemplation, and Sarah remembers her grandmother's hands teaching her to braid sweetgrass, the careful over and under motion that could not be rushed, the way each strand had to find its place in the larger pattern before the next could be added. And she sees now that their exploration of this transformed world has followed the same gentle logic, each discovery making space for the next understanding to emerge. Eleanor arrives at Starwell carrying a canvas bag filled with specimens she and William have gathered from around Thornfield, her footsteps soft on the stone path that leads down to the pool's edge, and she settles beside Sarah with the comfortable quiet of someone who has learned that the most important conversations happen in the spaces between words, in the shared attention that develops when people look together at mysteries that cannot be solved quickly or easily but only lived with and gradually understood. William follows shortly after, his notebook tucked carefully in his coat pocket, filled with sketches and measurements that represent months of patient observation. And as he kneels beside the glowing water, he sees in its depths the reflection of stars that seem closer tonight, more accessible somehow, as if the universe itself has drawn nearer to witness their careful work of noticing and recording and allowing wonder to guide them toward questions they could never have imagined when they first began walking the paths that brought them here. The lamp light flickers across their faces as they sit together in comfortable silence, each one holding pieces of the larger puzzle they have been assembling not through force or urgency, but through the simple practice of paying attention to what the world offers when approached with curiosity rather than certainty, with openness rather than the need to categorize and control. And Sarah thinks about how different this feels from the rushed investigations she has known before. How this transformed landscape has taught them to move at the speed of stone and water, to measure progress in the gradual accumulation of insight rather than the sudden flash of revelation. The tea in her cup cools slowly, and she watches steam rise in patterns that remind her of the way mist forms over the pool in the early morning hours, moisture gathering and dispersing according to temperature differences so subtle they can barely be measured yet profound enough to create the conditions where understanding can emerge like dew condensing on surfaces that have grown still enough and patient enough to receive what the air offers when it is ready to give up its secrets. Thomas sets his lamp on a flat stone and opens his journal to pages filled with careful drawings of crystal formations and water flow patterns. And in the gentle light, he sees not just scientific data but a record of attention paid and time spent in the presence of phenomena that reveal themselves only to those willing to sit quietly and wait for the slow unfolding of meaning that operates according to schedules written in geological time rather than human urgency. Eleanor unpacks her specimens with the careful movements of someone who has learned to handle fragile things, each fossil and mineral sample wrapped in cloth that holds the warmth of her hands. And as she arranges them on the stone beside the pool, she remembers her childhood fascination with maps, the way she would trace routes with her finger and imagine the footsteps of travelers who had walked those paths before her, carrying their own questions and discoveries across landscapes that held stories she could only guess at but somehow felt connected to through the simple act of following the lines that marked where human curiosity had led people to explore the unknown territories that lay beyond the edges of what they thought they understood. William sits cross-legged on the smooth stone and pulls out his collection of pressed flowers and leaves, specimens that show the subtle ways plants have adapted to conditions that exist when environmental chemistry operates according to principles that reward patience over competition, cooperation over conquest. And he thinks about the gardeners who came before him, the generations of people who learned to work with soil and seed and season through careful observation of what flourished and what struggled, accumulating wisdom grain by grain, until they understood how to create conditions where life could express its fullest potential without forcing or rushing the natural processes that govern growth and flowering and the patient transformation of seed into fruit. The stars will slowly overhead, their positions shifting with the Earth's rotation in patterns that have remained constant across human history, even as everything else about this world has been transformed by the absence of lunar influence. And Sarah finds comfort in this continuity, in the way stellar light continues to reach across vast distances to touch their upturned faces with photons that began their journey before human consciousness emerged from the intersection of matter and chemistry, and time to ask questions about its own existence and place in the larger story of cosmic becoming. The luminescent water pulses gently with rhythms that seem to echo something deep within their own bodies, and Thomas wonders if the chemical processes that create the pool's glow might resonate with the electromagnetic fields generated by neural activity, creating a form of communication that operates below the threshold of conscious awareness, but somehow influences the quality of attention they bring to their observations and the depth of connection they feel with the natural processes they have come to study and document and gradually understand. Eleanor traces with her finger the spiral patterns carved in the stone around the pool's edge, following lines that curve inward toward centers that seem to hold the accumulated energy of countless years of patient formation. And she remembers walking labyrinths in her youth, the way the path wound back on itself in patterns that created space for meditation and contemplation, for the kind of thinking that happens when the mind is allowed to move at the speed of footsteps rather than the frantic pace of modern life, when understanding can emerge from the simple act of placing one foot in front of the other while holding questions gently rather than grasping for answers that might not be ready to reveal themselves. William dips his hand in the warm water and feels the subtle tingle of dissolved minerals against his skin. And he thinks about the underground rivers that feed this pool, water that has traveled through darkness for perhaps centuries before emerging here to catch starlight and hold it like a cupped palm holds the light of candles, creating illumination that serves no practical purpose except to remind those who find it that beauty exists for its own sake, that the universe creates wonders not because they are useful, but because existence itself finds joy in the infinite variety of forms that matter and energy can take when given time and space and the right conditions for their essential nature to unfold. The night air carries the scent of stone dust and mineral water, fragrances that speak of deep time and patient processes. And Sarah breathes deeply as she remembers her great-aunt's rock garden, the careful arrangement of stones and drought-resistant plants that created habitat for small creatures who understood how to find shelter and sustenance in landscapes that might seem harsh to those who had not learned to read the subtle signs of abundance that exist in places where life has adapted to. Conditions that reward careful attention and long-term thinking rather than quick exploitation of temporary opportunities. Thomas closes his journal and looks around at his companions, seeing in their faces the same quality of quiet satisfaction that he feels, the contentment that comes from work done carefully and thoroughly, from questions asked with genuine curiosity rather than the need to arrive quickly at predetermined conclusions, and he realizes that their investigation of this transformed world has changed not just their understanding of alternative physical laws and environmental conditions, but their relationship to the very process of inquiry itself, teaching them to value the journey of discovery as much as any destination they might eventually reach. Eleanor folds her specimens back into their protective cloth wrappings, each one returning to darkness that preserves rather than conceals, and she thinks about libraries and archives, the careful preservation of knowledge that allows wisdom to accumulate across generations through the patient work of those who understand that truth reveals itself slowly and must be tended like gardens or friendships, with attention and care and the willingness to wait for understanding to ripen in its own time, rather than forcing premature conclusions that might satisfy immediate curiosity but fail to honor the deeper complexity of what they are trying to comprehend. William stands and stretches, feeling in his muscles the pleasant fatigue that comes from time spent in contemplation, and he looks up at stars that seem to pulse with the same gentle rhythm as the luminescent pool, as if the entire universe participates in cycles of attention and rest, expansion and contraction, questioning and integration that operate across all scales of space and time and create the conditions where consciousness can emerge from matter and energy to contemplate its own existence and wonder about its place in the larger story of cosmic evolution and transformation. The lamp flame wavers slightly in the night breeze, casting dancing shadows that play across the stone formations like memories made visible, and Sarah feels grateful for the path that brought them to this place of discovery, for the patience that allowed them to move slowly enough to notice details that might have been missed in a hurried investigation, for the trust that let them follow questions without knowing where they might lead, and she understands now that their exploration of this moonless world has been as much about learning how to see and listen and wonder as it has been about documenting alternative possibilities for existence and consciousness and the relationship between organic and inorganic processes. The silence that settles around them feels full rather than empty, pregnant with possibilities that continue to unfold even as they sit quietly beside water that holds starlight like cupped hands hold prayer. And they know that their questions about this transformed landscape have opened onto larger mysteries about the nature of existence itself, about what it means for consciousness to emerge from the intersection of matter and energy and time in ways that allow the universe to become aware of its own infinite creativity and to ask questions about the conditions that make such awareness possible in the first place. And in the gentle glow of the luminescent pool, they rest inside these questions like travelers resting beside a warm fire, content to let understanding develop at its own pace while they tend the flame of curiosity that brought them this far and will carry them forward into whatever revelations tomorrow might bring. As the night deepens around the luminescent pool at Starwell, Sarah and Thomas and Eleanor and William find themselves drawing closer together, not for warmth but for the comfort that comes from shared wonder, their quiet presence beside the glowing water like 4 points of a compass that has found its true north in the simple act of witnessing mysteries that unfold according to their own patient schedule rather than human urgency or expectation. The lamp between them burns steadily, its flame unwavering in air that seems to hold sound and light differently than the atmosphere they remember from dreams of another world. And in its gentle illumination, they can see the stone formations that spiral outward from the pool's edge, each curve and hollow shaped by processes that operated according to mathematics written in the deep chemistry of elements that had time enough and space enough to express their essential nature without interruption. From the complex gravitational influences that normally complicate the simple beauty of how matter organizes itself when left alone to find its own patterns of becoming. Thomas traces with his finger the surface of the water, watching ripples spread in perfect circles that seem to carry information as much as motion, and he thinks about the underground networks that connect this pool to others scattered throughout the region around Thornfield and Millhaven. Water systems that flow according to principles of cooperation rather than competition, creating habitat for forms of life that bridge the gap between organic and mineral existence in ways that suggest consciousness itself might be more fundamental and more widely distributed than they had ever imagined possible. Eleanor holds one of her fossilized specimens up to the lamplight, seeing in its preserved structure evidence of evolutionary experiments that succeeded because environmental conditions remained stable long enough for life to explore alternative strategies for growth and reproduction and the transmission of information across generations, and she wonders what stories these ancient creatures might tell about the experience of existing at the intersection of biology and geology, about what it means to think and feel according to rhythms that stretch across timescales far longer than individual lifetimes, yet somehow remain connected to the immediate present through chemical processes that operate in the eternal now of molecular interaction and atomic exchange. William opens his notebook to a page filled with observations about the correlation between stellar positions and the timing of various natural phenomena. And in the patterns he has documented, he sees evidence of a world that has learned to read cosmic rhythms directly rather than through the mediation of lunar cycles, consciousness developing along pathways that allow for forms of awareness that transcend the usual boundaries between individual experience and the larger patterns that govern planetary and stellar evolution across astronomical distances and geological epochs. The water in the pool continues to pulse with its gentle radiance, and Sarah finds herself thinking about all the questions they have gathered rather than answered, all the mysteries that have deepened rather than resolved through their careful exploration of this transformed landscape, and she realizes that their investigation has taught them something more valuable than any single discovery about the nature of existence itself, about how understanding emerges not from forcing revelations but from creating conditions where truth can unfold at its own pace like flowers opening to receive morning light. The stone beneath them holds the day's warmth even as the air cools, and Thomas can feel through the rock the subtle vibrations that suggest ongoing processes in underground chambers where chemical reactions continue according to schedules that began millions of years ago and will continue long after their own brief presence has become part of the larger story of transformation and change that defines what it means for anything to exist rather than not exist in a universe where every moment brings new possibilities for matter and energy to discover alternative ways of organizing themselves into forms that can think and feel and wonder about their own existence. Eleanor folds her hands in her lap and looks up at stars that seem to pulse with the same rhythm as the luminescent pool, and she sees in their light evidence of connections that stretch across distances so vast that human consciousness can barely comprehend them. Yet somehow those stellar fires participate in the same fundamental processes that create the gentle glow in the water beside them, photons and minerals and dissolved chemicals all expressing different aspects of the same underlying creativity that moves through everything from atomic particles to galactic clusters in patterns too complex and beautiful for any single mind to grasp completely, but somehow accessible to the quiet attention they have learned to cultivate through their patient exploration of phenomena that reveal themselves only to those willing to sit with questions long enough for answers to emerge like dawn breaking across landscapes that have been waiting in darkness for the light that makes everything visible. William closes his notebook and sets it beside the pool. His observations complete for now, but his curiosity still growing like plants that have learned to find nutrients in soil that supports forms of life adapted to conditions that reward cooperation over competition, patience over urgency, deep attention over surface understanding, and he knows that their discoveries will continue to unfold in the days and weeks ahead as they reflect on what they have witnessed and allow its implications to settle into their understanding like sediment settling in still water until its weight creates its own clarity. The lamp flame flickers slightly as a gentle breeze moves across the pool's surface, creating ripples that carry the reflected light of stars in patterns that seem to encode information about the relationship between terrestrial and cosmic processes, between the chemistry of this particular place and the universal principles that govern how consciousness emerges from the intersection of matter and energy and time, wherever conditions allow for the kind of patient development that makes awareness possible in forms that range from the crystalline memory of minerals to the neural networks of biological creatures to possibilities they can only begin to imagine. Sarah reaches into her pocket and pulls out a small notebook of her own. Its pages filled not with scientific observations but with poetry that emerged during their exploration. Words that captured not just what they saw but how it felt to witness alternative possibilities for existence and consciousness and the relationship between mind and matter in a world where fundamental forces express themselves according to different configurations. And she reads softly in the lamplight verses that speak of luminous water and patient stone, and the way wonder can grow like coral formations when given time enough and space enough to develop according to its own internal logic rather than external pressure. Thomas stands and walks to the edge of the pool, kneeling to dip his hands once more in water that feels like liquid starlight, and as he cups the luminescent liquid between his palms, he sees in its glow a reflection of everything they have discovered and everything that remains mysterious, all the questions that opened onto larger questions until they found themselves not seeking answers so much as learning to live comfortably inside uncertainty, to find peace in the recognition that existence itself is far stranger and more wonderful than any theory or explanation could ever capture completely. Eleanor rises and begins to gather their belongings with the unhurried movements of someone who has learned that every ending is also a beginning, that the completion of one exploration opens space for the next understanding to emerge, and she packs their specimens and notes with the same care she might use to tend seedlings that will grow into gardens, whose full beauty will not be visible for seasons yet to come but whose potential already exists in the patient attention they have received. William helps her fold the canvas bags and secure the lamp for their journey back to Millhaven. And as they prepare to leave Starwell, he takes one last look at the spiral formations around the pool's edge, seeing in their curves and hollows a kind of writing that tells stories about the patience of stone and the creativity of water and the way time itself can become a medium for the expression of beauty that serves no purpose except to remind those who encounter it that existence itself is a gift that unfolds moment by moment through processes too complex and wonderful for any single perspective to encompass fully. The four of them walk slowly up the path that leads away from the pool, their footsteps soft on stone that has been worn smooth by countless others who came before them to witness the same mysteries and ask the same questions about what it means for consciousness to emerge from matter and energy in forms that can recognize their own existence and wonder about their place in the larger story of cosmic becoming. The lamplight creates a moving circle of illumination that reveals each step while leaving the larger landscape softly hidden in darkness that feels protective rather than threatening. And Sarah thinks about how their exploration has taught them to be comfortable with partial visibility, with understanding that develops gradually rather than all at once, with knowledge that grows like the mineral formations around the pool through the slow accumulation of insight rather than sudden revelation. As they reach the crest of the hill above Starwell, they pause to look back at the gentle glow that marks the location of the pool, its radiance barely visible through the stone channels that frame it, but somehow still present like a pulse of light that connects the deep chemistry of the Earth with the stellar fires that burn across distances so vast they can only be measured in units of time rather than space. And Thomas feels in that moment the truth that all their discoveries have been pointing toward the recognition that consciousness and matter are not separate phenomena but different expressions of the same fundamental creativity that moves through everything from atomic particles to galaxies in patterns that create the conditions where awareness can emerge and recognize itself and wonder about the infinite possibilities that remain always just beyond the edge of current understanding. The lamp flame grows smaller as they begin their descent toward Millhaven, its light seeming to merge with the starlight that falls across the transformed landscape like blessing. And Eleanor knows that they carry with them not just the memory of what they have witnessed but something more precious, the capacity to approach mystery with patience and wonder rather than the need to categorize and control, the ability to find peace in questions that may never be answered completely but somehow contain within themselves all the meaning anyone could ever need. William walks beside her in comfortable silence, feeling in his bones the satisfaction that comes from work done carefully and thoroughly, from attention paid to phenomena that revealed themselves slowly, and only to those willing to wait for understanding to develop at its own pace rather than forcing premature conclusions that might satisfy immediate curiosity but fail to honor the deeper complexity of what they were trying to comprehend. The village lights grow brighter as they approach Millhaven, warm yellow windows that speak of human presence and the comfort of shelter, and the simple pleasures of hot tea and soft beds that await them after their long exploration of landscapes both outer and inner. And Sarah feels grateful for the path that brought them to this place of discovery, for the companions who shared the journey, for the questions that opened onto larger questions until they found themselves living inside mystery, rather than trying to solve it. The lamp flame wavers as they reach the outskirts of the village, its light growing dimmer but somehow more concentrated, like consciousness itself as it prepares to rest and dream and process all the wonder it has encountered during the day's patient exploration of what it means to exist in a universe where every moment brings new possibilities for awareness to recognize itself in forms that range from the luminescent chemistry of underground pools to the neural networks of creatures who can ask questions about their own existence and find peace in the asking itself rather than in any final answers that might bring the questioning to an end. As they extinguish the lamp and say their quiet goodnights beneath a sky that stretches infinite and star-filled above them, they breathe deeply of air that carries the scent of stone and water and growing things, and in that breath they hold everything they have discovered and everything that remains to be explored, all the questions that will continue to unfold like the patient formation of crystals in caves that grow more beautiful with each passing year, and they know that their exploration of this moonless world has taught them something essential about the nature of wonder itself, about how consciousness learns to recognize its own infinite creativity reflected in every phenomenon from the spiral patterns carved in stone to the vast architecture of space and time that creates the stage where all stories of existence play out their eternal dance of becoming and transformation under the wide sky that holds everything in its gentle embrace of starlight and possibility and the endless gift of another moment to breathe and wonder and exist.